And if they were just wearing their ordinary clothes, they thought that the person noticed what they were wearing less than they actually did. If they were wearing something embarrassing, they thought they noticed it more than they actually did. So we tend to sort of overestimate how harshly other people are judging us, right? And underestimate how much they just notice us on the regular. And so you can imagine, like, I know it'd be ideal to sort of put this in a sports context. So I'm imagining a situation where, like, you're just practicing and you're kind of in the zone doing your own thing and not thinking anybody's really paying attention to you. And then you make some terrible mistake. And then you look around and think, like, oh my God, everybody just saw that. And you think that the thing that people remember are the mistake you made. You think, that is the thing everyone suddenly paid attention to, but they were noticing you the whole time.
Vanessa, so pleased to have you on the podcast. How are things with you?
They're very well. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I'm keen to get into your book. For those who don't know, you have more influence than you think. And I saw this on Twitter. I saw some of your material, and I just thought I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. And I've really, really enjoyed reading through it. I feel like I know you, and you don't know me. So I feel like I know you because you've made it quite personal as you've shared some of those personal anecdotes and insights as you've gone through. But for those who don't know you, could you just give us a bit of a background to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess a lot of those anecdotes have to do with my husband and kids, and so it's more sort of the personal anecdotes. But in terms of my professional background, I've been trained as a psychologist ever since my undergraduate university years. I have a PhD in social psychology, and I basically do experimental social psychology where I look at social influence. But I look at social influence in a different way than many other people do. So instead of looking at how to get people to do things for you, I look at our assumptions about what will get people to do things for you and whether they are accurate or not. And what I find is that in general, people tend to have this misperception that they're less influential than they actually are, and that people are more likely to say no to them, less likely to listen to them, notice them, etc. And so that's my psychology training, and I do these lab studies for the most part. And now I'm a professor here at Cornell in organizational behavior, applying a lot of these insights to those kinds of topics, like in the workplace, essentially.
And so how did you get into this field? What kind of led you in? What was that journey, that path for you?
Yeah, I mean, from the very beginning as an undergrad, I fell in love with psychology just immediately. It was a click. And then I graduated from my undergraduate degree and went into marketing because I really thought that advertising and marketing was going to be the place where I was going to apply psychology. And I was so excited. I wound up getting hired by Ogilvy & Mather, huge advertising agency in New York City. It was my dream job in so many ways, but I wound up being in the account management department, which means it was like a lot of just like talking to people and a lot less doing anything. And so what I discovered there was that there was this one department I kept gravitating towards, which was the market research department, where they actually, research market trends and see what people respond to and run focus groups and things like that. And I talked to someone about, like, how do you get there? And everyone there had a PhD. And so I kind of had that in the back of my mind, decided I just didn't like corporate America that much, wound up doing a few other things. I worked in a sleep lab. I worked in elder care, other ways of just testing out different psychology adjacent fields, and then eventually went back to get my PhD. Thought I would eventually go back to advertising with that PhD because I just still had that idea in my head, but I just fell in love with teaching and research for the sake of research, just like I could do this every day and publish, and I love to write. And so I just kept taking kind of the next step to stay in academia and kept getting lucky. And so wound up here.
I was wondering whether it was the fact that in social psychology, you get to do experiments where you have to put someone in a t-shirt with Barry Manilow on, or get experiments that ask people how much it would cost them to be bribed to dance in front of people. There's some quite cool little aspects to the work, isn't there, really?
There are, and but those are two of my favorite experiments in the whole wide world. And they're exactly the kind of thing that makes social psychology kind of fun and creative. But they also, both of those findings. So interestingly, they were done by, one of them was by Tom Gilovich, the other one, the lead author is Leif Van Boven. Both of them did it at Cornell. They were both, Leif was a PhD student here. Tom Gilovich is one of my colleagues here. So there is this kind of like, this university has this like kind of creative background of social psychology experiments, which also kind of drew me to it. It makes me excited to be here. But those are not just fun. So like, as you said, in those studies, people have to wear an embarrassing t-shirt and walk in front of people and see if people notice them, right? So they wear this Barry Manilow t-shirt in one of the studies. In the other study, they have to get up in front of a stage and dance in front of people to Super Freak, and in front of like all their friends, basically like hundreds of people in this auditorium. So you would think like, oh my God, psychologists just make people do these wacky things for their own amusement. But both of those are classic studies because they actually reveal some fundamental aspects of human psychology. So both of them are sort of revealing this tendency we have to misperceive how others are perceiving us, right? So the Barry Manilow t-shirt, people think that everyone's noticing this embarrassing t-shirt. Everyone's sort of, whispering and gossiping about them. This idea that we have that, oh my God, everyone can see that I'm having a bad hair day, when in fact, hardly anyone noticed this embarrassing thing.
Yeah.
And then the dancing one just illustrates that we think that everybody else would be happy to get up on stage, when in fact, most people are nervous about that, just as nervous as us. And so that illustrates this thing called the illusion of courage, that we have this illusion that everybody else is more courageous than us. And so they're not just silly, they're like also really, I think, really, really fascinating phenomena that they illustrate.
So, well, quickly, the dancing study, I think it was $50 or something, that people would say that's how much I need. But everyone else is going to probably just go for it for about $20. I think it was. I read that and thought, I would probably put a lot more than $50 down. If I'm going for it, I might as well actually get something back. But so that was fascinating. But the start of the book, then, that was really interesting for me about this change in our perception of how people notice us, or what they might be judging, what they might be thinking, how we might be being assessed. So the Barry Manilow t-shirt, under one condition, that you put this garish t-shirt on and you think that people are going to notice you, whereas perhaps you underestimate just your influence on the crowd if you're just going about your day-to-day work. So the difference being there that you emphasized was when you are self-conscious. When you are self-conscious, you are anticipating that other people will be thinking about you differently. They'll think that they're going to be judging you. Why do you think that might be the case then?
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you said, there's this other work, and it's referred to as the invisibility cloak illusion, that we think actually that no one's sort of noticing us and we're kind of invisible to other people, when in fact other people do notice us more than we realize. But when we have something that we're acutely self-conscious about, like this Barry Manilow t-shirt or a bad hair day or whatever it might be, some faux pas, we think more people are noticing us than actually are. And so the idea is that basically, as we go through life, our ordinary day to day, we're just not super focused on ourselves. We're kind of looking at everybody else and, noticing what everybody else is doing and kind of assuming nobody's really looking at us. And part of that is all these social behaviors that people engage in where they try not to look like they're staring at you, So, if you look at someone and catch their eye, they quickly look away. And so for the most part, you're missing those people sort of noticing you. And so we think like, okay, no one's really noticing me around, until we have something that we're really worried people are noticing. And then we're like, oh my God, everybody's looking at me. Right. And so Erica Boothby, who's the researcher who did this invisibility cloak illusion study, or this set of studies, kind of teased this out. And she had people come into the lab and just wear their ordinary t-shirt, or she had them wear an embarrassing t-shirt like Tom Gilovich had done with this Barry Manilow t-shirt. And she asked them, how much is this, did this other person who we had to interact with notice your t-shirt or what you were wearing? And if they were just wearing their ordinary clothes, they thought that the person noticed what they were wearing less than they actually did. If they were wearing something embarrassing, they thought they noticed it more than they actually did. So we tend to sort of overestimate how harshly other people are judging us, right? And underestimate how much they just notice us on the regular. And so you can imagine, like, I know it'd be ideal to sort of put this in a sports context. So I'm imagining a situation where, like, you're just practicing and you're kind of in the zone doing your own thing and not thinking anybody's really paying attention to you. And then you make some terrible mistake, and then you look around and think, like, oh my God, everybody just saw that. And you think that the thing that people remember are the mistake you made. You think, that is the thing everyone suddenly paid attention to, but they were noticing you the whole time.
Yeah, when I was reading that, I was thinking about this sort of heightened sense of self-awareness that athletes often have when it gets closer and closer to a competition. And it was piquing my interest of thinking of what that phenomenon might be, where obviously you're thinking about the crowds, obviously you're thinking about perhaps the media pressure, or hoping you want to do well, hoping you don't want to mess up, but also internally that often athletes will report that they feel as though they're assessing and reevaluating that niggle from last year. How do I actually feel? I'm feeling nervous, and what's that making me also feel? And so there's a sense of that surveying and assessing how they're going. That's sort of what it made me recognize or connect with, that the influence of other people or that goal or that intensity is changing the way I'm thinking about myself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I could definitely see that being the case, when the spotlight's not on you, when you're not gearing up for anything, when it's not like a media circus around you or whatever might be going on, you kind of just feel almost invisible to some extent, like you're out of the spotlight and no one's really paying attention, but people are still noticing you. And then when things start to hype up, it's like it just all becomes super intense. And then you think everyone's scrutinizing you and judging you so much for every little thing. And it's probably less so than you actually think is the case. So it's kind of just balancing out those two kind of biases.
Yeah, and so that invisibility cloak was an interesting dynamic that you explored both as a member of the audience or as a member of a team or a boardroom or that meeting environment, when sometimes people go into those just thinking there's not much point me being here, or there's little influence that I'm actually having on the outcome of a meeting. And I mean, you give a couple of different examples, one of which that really resonates to me about the sort of dynamics in the room that you must make sure you're picking up on in order for you to be influential. I certainly try and do that when I go and do talks, for example. I'll be like, right, what have you just done? Have you just done auditing and finance stuff? And now I'm going to come in and try and share some insights with you. Or has there been some redundancies, or are you under financial threat as a business? I've got to tune into that. But what was really interesting was that dynamic of just thinking how influential you might be, even though you might not speak, even though you might not necessarily be the one who's making a decision. That's such an interesting term. What was it? Audience tuning? Was that what you'd called it?
Yeah, I think this is such a powerful concept, because in part, I think we have a misconception about what influence means. And we think if you ask who has influence in a room, people assume it's that person standing in the front of the room, with the microphone on the podium, on the stage, with the PowerPoints, whatever it is, the person doing the most talking. And we tend to forget that everybody else in that room also is influencing one another and the speaker. So anyone who's been in that position, at the front of the room, as you have, and I do when I teach all the time or when I give talks, you are monitoring that room for every cue that you can find that suggests like people are, getting it or agreeing with it. You're looking for nods, you're noticing when people look bored. and you really care, like you're up there, you care what these people think, you want to do a good job. And so we engage in, as you mentioned, audience tuning, where we tune our message to try to capture the interest and the sort of position of our audience. So sometimes that could be, I know that, you have this political stance, and so I tone down how I speak to you a little bit, or I know what you're dealing with in your organization, so I make sure that I address those kinds of things. Or I just see that, this example, you seem to be tuning out, and so I come up with another example and try that out. And what's interesting about audience tuning is the speaker is actually changing what they're saying and what they're doing based on the audience, who's not saying a thing often, who's just sitting there, or the speaker's just kind of presuming what the audience is thinking because they have an idea of what the audience might be thinking. And so they're changing what they're saying. And interestingly, that means the audience is affecting the messages that they're receiving, right, from the speaker. And there's a sort of secondary effect called the saying is believing effect, which is that once you say something and it looks like someone's like agreed with that, so you say something and the audience is kind of nodding, you start to believe that a little bit more. So I've said it, it seems like that went over well, that must be the right thing. And so simply by nodding along in the audience, simply by being there, you can actually change the speaker's views because they're adopting a certain message to please you. Once they do, they're like, okay, that seems like the right, good message. So now I believe it a little bit more. And one of the things that it has importance in all sorts of different ways. But one thing I like to talk about is the importance of diversity in a team or in a room, right? So if I am, in a very simple sort of form, if I'm addressing a group full of men and I'm talking about like HR practices or whatever it might be, it just might not be top of mind to talk about like parental leave or something like that. Now I have a room full of, is just a few women in that room. And all of a sudden that same conversation might just, take on a different sort of, it might go in a different direction because I'm noticing that my audience is a little more diverse, a little different. So I'm going to bring up things I might not have thought to bring up before. And now we're all having a discussion about a slightly different kind of topic than if the room had looked different. So it has all sorts of applications.
Mm. I can certainly relate to that, having done talks at, say, I remember one with my colleagues at One Dance UK. So they've just done an uplifting dance session together, 150 people. And I stand up and talk, and they're already in it. They're already super excited, and I just get carried away. I'm in this too, and they're finding stuff funny that's not supposed to be funny. I'm like, right, let's go, and it kind of emboldens you, it enlivens you. But equally, I remember doing a talk at a company who just had terrible financial results. Lots of people were redundant. I've been brought in to try and G people up, and just dead. Everyone's just no. And so actually, it's just right. I'm just going to play this fairly straight and kept it flat. And that also makes you think of how we've been engaging with each other during the pandemic over Zoom, cameras off sometimes, or you might be doing a talk to a group of people. One person's nodding, you sort of just fixate on that one person. Some of these small body language cues that we could all give off that I suppose we underplay or we don't recognize that important, but you could be encouraging somebody in the right direction, or perhaps the direction you want to, just by the way your eyes are shining.
It's true. It is funny how it's on Zoom, you really do fixate just by virtue of the app, right? And whoever's at the top there or whoever has their cameras on. So if you're one of the like small number of people who often have their camera on, you are impacting the speaker so much. And you probably don't even realize it because you're kind of like not as attuned to like how spotlighted you are for the speaker specifically. But yeah, and there's so much research now coming out comparing our in-person interactions to interactions over Zoom or even the phone or email and things like that. We even have some research showing that asking for things. So this is one of the areas of influence that I study is, asking for things and how likely people are to agree to do things for you. And again, whether we know the best way to ask for things to get that yes that many of us want. And what we find is that asking in person is so much more effective, just ridiculously more effective than asking over email. It's 34 times more effective in one of our studies. So just completely, blows email away. But even over Zoom or the phone, there is something about being present in a room with another person that creates a certain amount of trust, and they just kind of naturally give you more attention. And there's just something more. There's a theory called media naturalness theory that basically the more you kind of interact in a way that mimics natural interactions, which means like in-person, evolutionarily defined sort of interactions, the more influential you'll be, and the more trust and rapport is sort of developed. And so, yeah, I think we often don't realize, because in those studies as well, when we ask people, how should you ask? Basically, does it matter if you ask over Zoom or in person? People think it's going to be the same, but it's wildly more effective in person. And so we don't realize kind of all the things we lose when we do interact either just through mediated communication or with cameras off or whatever it might be.
Mm. That's so interesting. Certainly for a lot of people who are looking for opportunities, certainly in the world of sports performance, where they're quite rare, and actually it's quite guarded and secured off. We don't want anyone just bowling in. We're going to really filter who's going to be in the inner circle working with athletes. To find those opportunities, often people just email. I'll just email the top club, and if I haven't heard back, oh well, that's it. When actually, maybe making the journey, knocking on doors, it's going to make so much more difference by what you said. It also alludes to this probably the dynamic that we're facing at the moment about whether we should be working at home, whether we should be returning to the office, whether actually our influence genuinely is going to be more effective when we're interacting with people face to face.
Yeah. And, there are so many positives about this kind of shift to more virtual and more hybrid opportunities. So there's always a trade-off, right? Because it allows certain groups of people to participate more kind of in the workplace, especially women and underrepresented minorities and people, who can't come in as much, or it's more difficult to come in. But at the same time, so much does get lost, we're seeing, as the research is coming in, comparing, Zoom and to in person in particular, because like Zoom has felt so much like, oh, we could just keep doing business as usual. And so, in our research, it seems like you have some less influence over Zoom, or at least we haven't sort of figured, you need to work harder, I'd say, to have the same influence you would have in person. So whereas in person, you can ask something in this clunky kind of, just totally inarticulate way, and people still feel like it's hard to say no. Over Zoom, you may need to actually be more articulate and really think through what you want to say and ask in a very careful way, so there is an adjustment, I think. There's also some new research that just came out showing that people are actually less creative when they work together over Zoom as opposed to in person. And so we're also potentially losing some elements of creativity and influence. And there are all sorts of things that, we're starting to realize we need to at least make up for in some way if we're not going to actually be in person.
Yes, and that last phrase really, to me, sums up a lot of what we've lost. You have to be more intentional about some of these things, that but the body language signals that you might pick up as people are coming into a meeting or an environment for that day, you're probably going to lose a lot of those when it's down the screen, down the lens, and you're sort of half presenting yourself. I don't know. I assume, or you've got your cameras off and you haven't got those body language cues that you could pick up. And so I'm encouraging a lot of people to be asking how are you feeling before we think about working through our agenda.
Yeah, I think that's huge, is actually making that social connection, because that is one thing that's lost. I don't know if you've noticed this, but definitely here, Zoom meetings, everyone gets there exactly at the, start of the meeting, whereas they would filter in and there'd be a lot of chit chat at the beginning of an
Yeah.
in-person meeting. So you had more of that interaction and, that natural interaction in the hallway and things like that. Another thing that, in addition to this sort of like social connection, right, is that we also lose people's opinions in discussions because it's so easy to just check out. One of my colleagues talks about the sort of the unmute button being like this major barrier. Like, are you actually going to click the unmute button and kind of say your piece? And it's so much bigger of a deal to sort of jump in and occupy the spotlight on Zoom, as opposed to maybe if you were like in a meeting all together and you can kind of just jump in and people could talk over each other without making it impossible to understand or hear. And so in addition to going around asking how everyone's doing, if there is a discussion, going around and saying, okay, everyone is going to just give their quick little spiel about how they feel about this, right? As opposed to letting whoever wants to unmute and feels comfortable enough to unmute, just jump in.
That's sort of that boiling up. I'm going to speak, and when you're in a room, you can hear someone go,
yeah, exactly.
I've got, and they don't do that. Obviously, they have to reach for the mouse and click and look for that
Yeah.
signal, and then you're looking in the participants list for someone who's unmuted, and you then volunteer
Yeah.
them in. And yeah, okay, wow.
It's the unmute now is like because you see the unmute and then the mute back and then the unmute.
Look, I'm going to quote part of your book back to you. So, you have more influence than you think. Page 46. In truth, facts are less effective at changing people's behaviors and beliefs than social norms or knowing what other people believe and are doing. That's quite a powerful statement. Certainly from maybe this is me being stereotyping to the world of science, where you lead with facts and you lead with knowledge, but it's worth recognizing just how powerful the situation, the environment, the people that you're working with, the blend of the dynamics within a team, rather than whether something's known to a level of probability. Could you just unpack that statement a little bit more for me?
Yeah, and it is interesting because so many people think that facts are the way to convince someone. If I just kind of put out all the facts and I make my case really clear and logical, I'll convince you. And one way that we do that, so Robert Cialdini, who is like one of the godfathers of influence, talks about the difference between two types of norms. One are prescriptive norms. It's like what you should do. And so it could be something like, you should recycle, or you should exercise, X amount. And then there are descriptive norms, and those are what everybody else is actually doing. And the most important people to you are usually people like you. And so what's interesting is even if the prescriptive norm is like, I should exercise, there's all this data showing all the reasons I should exercise. And you have convinced me laying out all this data that like clearly that is the thing I should do, right? But if I look around and no one I hang out with exercises, I am so much less likely to do that just because the social norm is not to exercise. But then if I look around and most of the people I know exercise, all of a sudden now that becomes normal to me and I start doing that. The recycling example is really, Cialdini has some studies on like where you recycle or you hang up towels, and you do these kinds of things that are more immediate, like exercise is more kind of a long-term thing. But if like a sign says, recycle, but then you see that everyone is just throwing the recycling like wherever they want, people are less likely to actually recycle than if they see that, oh, and everyone is actually following that sign. Because if you think about it, if there's something hard or ambiguous and you're not, you're kind of like, I know I should do that, but there are all these kinds of barriers to me doing that. We look around and see like, well, how are other people prioritizing? What are other people doing? And then we use other people's behavior as sort of our model for what we think and believe and eventually do.
Hmm. And you gave a couple of nice examples of what I would call a shouty intervention versus a encouraging, supportive intervention. I can't remember the exact words, but people were emailed, you should do sit-ups. It's good for your core. Do it now. versus something like, I'm changing my tone now to fit the character, but they're good for you. You can do it. That was the sort of tone, and you found a difference in response based on if somebody doesn't want to do those sit-ups, the shouty one was actually reduced the interest. Was that right? And then shouty and encouraging was basically neutral if people were indifferent. But if people were bought in and actually wanted to do exercise, the sort of the more assertive instruction actually did help.
Yeah, this was interesting because this research, there were several different studies looking at different parts of this. And so one of the questions was like, what do people think will get people to do what you want them to do? Like, say, I want you to eat healthy, or say, I want you to exercise. You know, people in general think that the shoutier, assertive thing is always going to be better, right? So they're not sort of calibrating based on the other person and kind of meeting that other person where they are. They're just thinking like, I am frustrated. You need to eat better. I'm going to be very assertive and tell you, this is why you need to do this, right? Like, I'm definitely just do it. But in fact, as you said, you know, the shoutier message only works for people who basically are already bought in, and they just kind of need that coaching. It's like, you know, I just need someone to yell at me and tell me to do it because I'm kind of already convinced that this is what I want to do. But if you, most cases, we're trying to convince someone who, you know, is resistant and has been resistant for a while. And if we're kind of shouting at them to do something that they are resistant to do, they turn off, right? And that is actually less effective than something that's like, you know, well, look, you know, here's one suggestion for something you could try. And that softer approach we often feel is ineffective. This is one of the kind of aspects of underestimating our influence is we think influence is shouty. We think influence is you know, we want to see that effect right there. We're not patient with influence. We think subtle is not influential, but these more kind of gentle, subtle requests, and letting them sink in, you know, being patient and hoping that, you know, tomorrow that person might still be thinking about that thing you said, and maybe you can remind them or have somebody else remind them. There's a lot of long game and influence that people overlook because they want that short-term kind of like, you know, I told you to get down on the ground and do 10 sit-ups and you did it. And so I influenced you, you know, as opposed to like, I suggested that maybe you should try to start incorporating this into your routine. And, you know, maybe I'll revisit that in a couple of days and eventually it'll sink in.
So there's a couple of dynamics there that are emerging for me. One is so how much someone's bought in, and so whether they're actually resistant or they've actually not they're repelling the concept. What about any advice for some of those coaches out there that might be working with someone who's talented but perhaps low diligence, where from a psychological point of view, maybe that's low conscientiousness, when there's oh, you've got potential, you could, you know, you could achieve great things, but you're very laid back, you can't be bothered. So I'm just wondering if there's any specifics around that particular dynamic when it might not be about buy-in or not, they just don't really kind of care.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's a lot of research on kind of the things that make people slip up when they want to do something, like they want to change. Katie Milkman has a book that came out recently, How to Change, and she addresses a lot of these kinds of questions about like, you know I could be great at this. I really care, but I just don't get my act together on a daily basis, right? And so there are several things you kind of have to figure out what it is that's causing that and then address that. So sometimes it's an attention problem, right? I just keep forgetting. And so you find ways to keep whatever it is that person needs to do top of mind, right? And you make it, you know, sort of unforgettable. You know, sometimes it's a motivation thing, and you work out some sort of reward system, whether it's like pairing something that they like to do, so they kind of want to do that thing, with something that they really hate. So she calls this temptation bundling, where you take something that you really like, you know, okay, and that's tempting, and I keep doing that instead of the thing I'm supposed to be doing. And you somehow either let them do that while they're doing the thing they're supposed to do, or, as a reward after. And so I'd say it really comes down, there's not like a universal, like, and this is how you get someone to stay on track. It's like, first is identifying the barriers, then is addressing the specific barrier. But again, I think that's more of like it's more patient and long-term. And we often resort to shouty, like, come on, I'm going to tell you again why this is important and all the things you could be, as opposed to kind of more mundane, like logistical things, like, let's actually track your day and see what it is that's causing you to slip up.
You had quite a theme of anticipating how your request might be received, whether it was asking, whether it was anticipating how someone was perceiving. And it always felt like you were making the case for people to be a bit kinder to themselves and actually backing themselves, give it a go, rather than anticipating that level, as you called it, embarrassment, when actually it's not that embarrassing. If they just said no, it just perhaps wasn't right for them. That sense of quitting or not doing something because you've talked yourself out of it before you've actually tried. What's going on there in our minds?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's a huge theme in the book, is this idea that we anticipate so much more negativity coming from other people than we often experience if we actually test out those kind of intuitions or those worries. And so that's true in so many different sort of examples in the book. So one, I mean, we have studies where we have people go out and give people compliments, right? And what could be, nicer than getting a compliment? And yet our participants worry that they're going to be annoying the person or bothering the person going up and giving them a compliment. Our participants in some of my colleagues' studies think that people are rehashing conversations that they had and kind of nitpicking every little thing they said, and that they didn't like the conversation as much, and they caught like every inarticulate moment. And then in our studies, as you mentioned, people expect rejection, and they think if I ask for something, people are going to say no and be annoyed that I'm asking. And so because of that, we hold back and we don't ask, or we negotiate ourselves down before we actually go and ask, because we think like, why would this person would never say yes to this, so I'm going to ask for this lesser thing before even asking for that bigger thing. And I think there's kind of a couple of broad psychological phenomena that underlie all of that. And I'd say the two biggest things are negativity bias, which I'm sure, that pervades all sorts of areas of life. And so I'm sure you've encountered this plenty before, but the idea that the negative looms larger than the positive, right? And so even if most people say yes to us, we remember that one person who said no and kind of extrapolate it and feel like, oh, everyone says no to me, right? When in fact, if you looked at the data, most people are actually saying yes. And so, or we might, remember that one faux pas, and that's the only thing we can remember, and not like the 10 really lovely articulate things we said in that same like speech or conversation or whatever it might be. And so we are really harsh on ourselves because we focus on the negative. And then the second big thing that pervades all those is something we call egocentrism. And that is the inability for us to really get inside the heads of another person and sort of understand how they are viewing us. We tend to be trapped in our own heads. And so if we are sort of nitpicking every little thing we've said, and we know everything we should have said and we didn't say, we know how anxious we were and how all the things we were worried about, we kind of assume that someone else is seeing all that too. But our assumptions about what other people are thinking are often wrong. And so even if you do these simple sorts of activities or visualization exercises where you imagine asking someone for help, for example, and you put yourself in that position and you think of all the anxiety that goes along with that and how awkward it's going to be, and all those negative feelings. And then you have someone totally switch perspectives and imagine someone's coming up to you and asking you for help, right? It's a whole different experience. It's like, oh yeah, I'd be happy to help that person in that situation. I would feel good about myself. I would feel like I did something nice and feel kind of honored that this person would ask me for my advice or something. And so we forget when we're in the one position, what it's like to be in that other position.
And is that what you would suggest people do? Flip it round before they actually go and ask for help, to put themselves in other people's shoes and how it would be received by them.
Yeah, I think that is a huge sort of suggestion, is to find ways to both get out of your own head. And that could be by sort of taking like a neutral party sort of perspective. If you're imagining like, I feel like I just sounded like an idiot in that conversation. Imagine a neutral party kind of watching that conversation, seeing what both people said. What would that person think? Probably not whatever you're thinking, right? And then also getting into the other person's head, which is really hard for us to do. But I think, especially when it's something like helping that all of us have done at some point in our lives, trying to recall a time that we were asked for help and we're happy to help the other person is, I think, a really helpful thing to remind ourselves of, that, actually, when you're on that other side, it doesn't feel like all these things you're worried that person is going to feel.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that certainly resonates for me working for myself, in that you feel awkward saying, "Would you like me to do some work for you?" You sort of anticipate that level of rejection, but to a certain extent, when someone asks me, "Can I do some work for you?" It's fine. Yes or no, it's fine. You're going to consider it appropriately, aren't you? But you mentioned there about that sort of priming, how you go into situations, and there was some really interesting stuff that you surfaced around power. So I was fascinated by this. And you mentioned a series of studies about priming your thoughts about a power-based relationship. So if I'm summarizing this correctly, please nitpick away if I haven't quite got this right, Vanessa. Is so participants were asked to recall a situation where they had power over somebody else, and whether that was teaching or instructing or whatever it might be, maybe a parent situation, or that they had received that power-based relationship. They were the receipt of it. Um, where they were asked to recall the situation and then given a subsequent task, and all sorts of quite unusual behaviors sort of seem to come out. So I remember one that you referred to where people were considering other people's perspectives differently. So they were drawing an E on their forehead, was that right? And they were less inclined to think about presenting it so it was suitable for someone else's perspective versus themselves. So if they had high power situations, so they're thinking about being dominated, if you like, they were more inclined to just think about themselves. Whereas if they were asked about a mentoring scenario, then they were more inclined to think about other people's perspectives. That's fascinating as a concept.
Yeah. And that, so there's so many studies about the effects of power and being in a position of power and feeling powerful on how we interact with other people and the environment, that suggests that, you might think like, well, people in positions of power, like coaches, I have some examples of like coaches and teachers and professors, people in positions of power, they must realize they have all this influence, right? But in fact, these studies suggest that actually there are certain sort of biases that come out when you are in a position of power that make you less likely in some cases to recognize the influence that you have in other people. And so one of them, as you're mentioning, is that when we are in a position of power, we're less likely to take other people's perspectives. And if you think about that, that just makes sense, right? If I'm the one in power and I say something, I'm not going to fret about how you took that thing I just said and kind of go over in my head a million times, what you thought of me in that meeting, because I'm the one in power. It's not as important for me to make sure that you like me as it is for you to make sure that I like you. And so one of the ways that they've tested this experimentally is through this experiment where they give people these power primes, and they're these writing primes where you're kind of writing about a time you either were in a position of power or a position where someone had power over you. But they really people get into them, right? So they actually do really evoke this, like you get back into that moment. And so you really feel a little bit more or a little bit less powerful when you do these primes. And then they had them, and this was a tiny study. And so there have been other studies, but this one is particularly kind of memorable, right? In terms of the way that they looked at perspective taking this study, and they had them write an E really quickly. They just said, okay, we're doing like this task to look at, I forget what it was, something random that was unrelated to perspective taking. So they weren't thinking about perspective taking, just write in the letter E on your head. And they would write a capital E, and they looked at how often the E was visible, readable sort of by the other person as an E, or backwards as if it was written, towards me. And the people in the high power prime, the people who felt more powerful, were less likely to write the E where they were considering someone else's perspective. Oh, this person's going to have to read this E, right? And so if we are less likely to perspective take when we're in positions of power, that means that when we say things, when we ask for things, we are less likely to try to consider how those things impact other people. And so we might miss some of the times we say something that really rubs someone the wrong way, or we ask someone to do something that they feel obligated to do, not just happy to do, and they feel like they can't say no to us. The other part of power is that it also makes us more, what people say, action oriented, or also we care less about like the situational constraints. Like, I'm not going to worry about what other people think in this situation. I'm just going to act. I'm just going to deal with it. And so in another study, they primed power again, and then they had this annoying fan blowing on participants. And it was unclear, it was very ambiguous whether you could move the fan or not, whether it was part of the experiment. It was just kind of this annoying fan. And if you were primed with power, you were more likely to just get up and turn the fan off, or get up and move the fan. And again, because you weren't worried that maybe you weren't supposed to, you just dealt with it. And so the part that applies to influence is that we often think, if I would just deal with this, right, why doesn't somebody else just deal with it? And forget that when you're in a lower position of power, you feel like you have to be more careful. You can't just act and assume you were allowed to do something, and so again, it makes us sort of miss times when we're like, why didn't you just tell me you didn't want to do that? You were uncomfortable with that, because that lower power person may not have felt comfortable saying something.
And there was another study that you mentioned about almost the opposite, or not the counter, when the high power prime actually led to greater creativity or less conformity. And so this has sort of got me thinking just about, there are situations where the position of power, so you might hold a leadership role over subordinates in a hierarchical situation, and so this might play out. But is this an applied technique that people could use when there's a certain capability required in a certain situation, that we need to innovate, we need to be thinking differently, or we need to be more empathic about how we consider each other's views if it's a very high challenge situation, and actually what the team needs is level of support? Is this a technique that you could almost use to evoke an appropriate behavior?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if anyone's looked at that. It's certainly possible. You're right. So in another study, priming power made people come up with a more original idea, because they weren't following along with the group, where low power people were kind of like, okay, if everybody else did that, I'll just do that too. Maybe, I don't know that, it's one of those things where it's like, if you want people to feel that way, is that the best way to get there? Or is there another better sort of way to get there? And I'm not really sure. And it's as with everything, there are these trade-offs. So that study is actually very comparable to the fan study, where it was like, I'm not going to worry about the norms here. It's ambiguous what the task is asking me for. I'm just going to do what I want and come up with the idea I want, or move the fan the way I want. It's just, I'm not going to consider everybody else in this moment. But that said, power is not inherently sort of tied to a lack of empathy and perspective taking. because there are people in positions of power who actually sometimes are better perspective takers, but it's because with their power, they also couple power with the sense of responsibility. So power always comes with opportunity and responsibility, right? Like you can move your organization in a new direction that you see and use your vision and kind of, also there's all sorts of personal opportunities, but also now you're in charge of a bunch of people and their future, and you have to decide how resources are allocated, and there's a lot of responsibility. And there's some people who actually sort of couple that responsibility part with the power more so than other people. And those people actually are greater perspective takers when they're in positions of power, because they're super aware. Like when I say this, like it means a lot. One expression one of my colleagues likes to use is, when you're in a position of power, your whisper sounds like a shout. And a lot of people don't realize that, but there is a subset of people who are acutely aware of that and the responsibility that comes with their power. So I say that just because it's not power itself necessarily, it's a lot of the attributes associated with power. So we can make power more empathetic if we kind of couple it with that responsibility element.
Yeah, that was a great quote. I love that one. What was it again? So it was Power's whisper feels like a shout.
Yeah, when you're in a position of power, your whisper sounds like a shout.
Yeah, and that really speaks to just an offhand glib comment. When you're in a position of leadership, you have to self-manage. You have to be very careful you don't spook the horses, but equally you've got to be active as a communicator. It's sort of that Vince Lombardi quote of the achievements of an organization, the results of the combined effort of each individual. So we're all in this. We've got to take each other's perspectives. But was it the John Lydgate quote? You can't please all the you can please some of the people all the time. You can't please all the people all the time, etc. You've got to hold those two together, haven't you? In that sense of pushing on and making decisions that not everyone's going to be happy about, being connected with a group and being considerate of those perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, all that comes with power. There are trade-offs with everything. There's trade-offs with low power, there's trade-offs with high power. And I think the key is really that awareness. It's so easy to forget that your whisper sounds like a shout to other people. And so this is where we get into, like, if you're, leading a discussion and you're the person in power, if you go first, no one's going to disagree with you, right? Like you just
Right.
basically came up with the answer, and it's going to be very hard, or that much harder, for people to come up with like a counter example. And so, they're just really simple things that we often forget. So we often rise through the ranks, reach a position of power, and then feel like we need to prove why we're there. And so we feel like we have to come up with the good ideas and prove we deserve this position. So we should talk a lot and explain, I think that's the impulse, is to justify that I deserve to be here. I deserve to be in this position. When in fact, when you get in that position, it's a lot more important to hold back and listen to everybody else's perspectives, because you're already in that position. They're, kind of already, it's a done deal. There is a certain element of, winning people over, winning their respect, but that
Yeah.
comes more from the listening piece than from the talking piece. And we forget that.
Yeah, there's so many athletes, coaches, leaders that I've spoken to who've said, "Oh, I wish I'd just been myself." In that initial taking on the international stage, or that leadership, that head coach position for the first time, I just wish I'd been myself. I was pretending to be somebody I wasn't really. And I don't know whether actually going through that period of time of awkwardness of I'm being somebody I'm not has actually made them then flip and reflect and truer to themselves, a bit like the athlete who overtrains and gets injured and then learns about regulating their training. They've got to make the mistakes for them to really deeply resonate. So yeah, I like that principle. I'm not quite sure whether it's actually a healthy thing for them to experience and go through.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's my favorite sort of thing about imposter syndrome is that
Yeah.
we feel like imposters when we're actually rising in the ranks, when we're doing the better we're doing, the more we feel like imposters. And so I think part of that is that, you wind up in this position, you're like, do I deserve this? Like, I'm just a kid. I still, and you feel kind of like an imposter. And so I think you try these things on because you don't feel like you should just be yourself because you're not sure you really belong there. And then eventually you settle in and realize I do belong here. I can be myself, and sort of reconcile that.
Yeah, amazing. So many fascinating insights. You mentioned a couple quite candid, quite unethical scenarios, such as coaches uh, asking players to perform certain acts, such as taking clothes off as punishment for missing free throws and so on. You've talked about consensual relationships in inverted commas, very deliberately, between CEOs and staffers. I'm curious to know and thoughtful of scenarios in situations where in sports where there's been abuse cases, there's been situations that have gone from innocent to questionable to unethical to wrong. And any thoughts about how people can be stronger, more confident in speaking up and speaking truth to power in a whistleblowing scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, a lot of so I guess to sort of put it into perspective, I guess the first half of the book is very much about you have more influence than you think. You can get help more readily than you think. Your voice is more, people are, will listen to you more than you think. And so it's a very kind of positive, more traditional, I'd say like self-helpy leadership type book. The second half is basically if you do have more influence than you think, and if people in power might have even more influence than they think, what does that mean? There's a responsibility that comes there, and we can accidentally, inadvertently misuse it at times.
Yeah.
Sometimes in these cases, it's not inadvertent, and yet there are these quotes, of, as you mentioned, the coach, the basketball coach, who had his players doing strip basically basketball, and each time they missed a free throw they had to take off an article of clothing to the point where they're doing wind sprints up and down the court totally naked, right? He was like, they could have said no, right?
Mm.
It's a case where they could have said no. And of course the players are like, this is my coach. I am in a Division I basketball team. I couldn't say no to my coach.
Right.
And so I think on the one hand, I think Me Too and a lot of the stories we've seen come out over the past few years has definitely been empowering to people who are being abused, to step forward. At the same time, I always worry about putting the onus on the person who's in the position of being abused to be the one who steps up, because they are the low power person, right? They have so much to risk,
Right.
and they often won't. And so I actually think that, for one, I mean, in cases where it's inadvertent, like genuinely inadvertent, I think people in positions of power, like coaches, doctors, who have trainers, like whoever is in charge of a team or athletes, we all need to be more aware of the influence we have in those positions, and the ways in which players may not push back, athletes may not push back, they may just take our word as gospel in a lot of cases, and worry about questioning things. And so we want to be more aware of that to avoid inadvertent abuses of power. And then for cases where it's blatant and there's actual abuses of power that are deliberate, then I actually think bystander interventions are the most useful thing, because once you get outsiders recognizing problematic dynamics and standing up and saying something, then often victims will come up and say something, because other people, they could tell other people have their back. But also it doesn't put the onus on the victim to do it, right? So if other people know the cues that they're looking for, whether it's other players, other members of the coaching staff, whoever it is, can actually speak up and say, I saw something weird, maybe we should investigate this, or I saw something that was concerning to me, and do some of that, make some of that effort so the onus isn't on the victim or the player. I think that's a particularly useful way of handling those kinds of situations.
So am I hearing things like some outside audit, a critical review, a board that might be able to check and challenge practice? Is that what you're suggesting there? That's there's an outside voice that recognises the dynamics that are in an environment?
I think it, you know, there's some advantages to outside voices, but I think actually the people who usually know what's going on are more internal. It's
Okay.
just not the person who's directly harmed potentially. And so if it is someone who's on the coaching staff, it makes it that much harder, right? Because they're involved and they also have something to lose. But if everyone's sort of aware, and there are trainings actually for bystander interventions to kind of deal with all the dynamics, that all the pressures of not speaking up when you see something, the if you see something, say something kind of thing, um, because it is hard. But outside organizations often aren't gonna see, people won't necessarily trust them to tell them what's really going on. So I think that's part of the solution, but definitely not the whole solution. I think people who are immediately involved and close to the athletes or the team or whoever it is need to be aware of how to speak up if they see something going on.
Yeah, and I was struck by the examples that you gave. I think it was McDonald's um, CEO, for example, about punitive measures for the top that ensures that it doesn't happen because rather than blaming the person perhaps in a lower power status, that actually the effect, the result, the consequences is born at the top.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's sometimes a lot of pushback on this of like, oh, wait, this happened and now you're going to oust a CEO who brings in this company,
Yeah.
billions of dollars. But it's just so interesting that there's this gut reaction to protect the person on top. Like, why would we ruin their lives, and potentially all these investors? So it's for a long time, it's been that the lower power person was very expendable, right? And so a lot of these new rules and regulations that have come into place that make the sort of punitive measures a little more balanced so that the person on top can actually be held accountable are kind of righting this unbalance that we had for so long. And one of the examples I give is like Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, when that all came out, Bill Clinton stayed president. He never had a problem finding work. He stayed in this really powerful position and, has done so many things in the years since. Whereas Monica, faced just incredible media scrutiny, had a really hard time finding work, and just suffered a lot from that fallout. And again, it's the lower power person winds up often in those cases suffering so much more. And so there is an element of these kinds of newer policies of kind of rebalancing things.
Yeah, I love that quote that you shared from Monica Lewinsky. No one asked Bill Clinton to change his surname, and that just strikes at the heart of that sense of, that just, you know, the power, the power is held at that top end, and almost a bubble of protection around that person. Yeah. As soon as you mention that, it just made me go, yeah, that's not right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Vanessa, what do you hope is the legacy of your book?
Um, I mean, I really hope that it reassures people, because I have found this research so reassuring. I think a lot of us have a lot of social anxiety and worries about how we come across to other people, whether we can ask other people for help, whether we should go up and talk to other people, all these kinds of doubts. And I've used this research for so long to reassure myself when I have those doubts. Actually, the research shows that this conversation was fine. You should stop, beating yourself up about it, or you should just ask this person for help, or, you liked what that person said, you should tell them, and so all of that has been incredibly reassuring and empowering to me. And so that is one major takeaway. And then, as I said, there's this other part where I really also hope that people take away this responsibility element, this idea that people do listen to the things you say. Even if you don't see them doing it, they may still be thinking about that next week. And so we should think about the way that we talk to other people and the information we spread and the things that we ask people to do. So one of the other things that I say in the book is that we all have things that reverberate in our heads. from people who said something maybe years ago that they probably don't even remember they said to us, and we can remember it to this day and maybe reflect on it regularly. And that's true for other people as well. They have the things we say reverberating in their heads. And so one of the big things I hope people take away from this is to make sure that the things they do say to other people count, because they may mean more than we realize.
Yeah, I mean, I got such a sense of that, of encouraging people to be authentic, to celebrate and recognize the influence that they have. And that's a good thing. But also, I had that balance of being mindful and protect and be careful with your influence too. Just being conscious of necessarily taking it too far, taking it in the wrong direction, it being a negative thing. So I'm going to channel the liking principle and encourage people to check out your book. But then, other than the book, so you have more influence than you think. Where else can people follow you and follow along?
Yeah, so you can find me at my website, which is vanessabohns.com. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at profbohns is my handle.
Wonderful. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.